It's a great privilege, and it's really nice to be in Slovakia. And when you move in the corridors, you listen to people, and it seems that they speak Ukrainian to you. So and that's why right now I find myself kind of weird because I speak English to such a close language participants. My report is in a way the continuation of the previous report, but with one difference, because Professor Kolomiyets had a very insightful look into the contemporary Ukrainian translations, while I will take the historical perspective, and this historical perspective will be based on the material of 4 Ukrainian translations of the monumental poem by Paul Valéry, Le cimetière marin. And why this case material was chosen is because exactly this translation multiplicity elicits this broad panorama of the Ukrainian translation culture of the second part of the 20th century. And it really shows the identity of the translator and all the perpetuaries that he had to pass along to publish his work, to make them visible to the target audience. And it really shows this kind of imperialistic policy that the dominant culture had on the Ukrainian literary policy system. Thus, my point of departure in this case would be, first of all, I would take this traditional stance and traditional dimension. I will move from the source text, and let us first have a very concise overview of the original. This poem was written in 1970, and it has a very deep self-referential character, because Paul Valéry visited when he was 50 this city of Set in the Mediterranean, where he was born and where he was brought up, and he really re-evaluated his life. And after the 20 years time gap of not writing poetry at all, he starts writing again. And the first really big poem that he wrote is Le cimetière marin, and what is more, after visiting this really small town, he makes a final decision, like a farewell message, that he wants to be buried at this cemetery near the sea. As you see right now on the photo, you see his grave, and you see this panorama that he was actually looking and enjoying, and actually maybe it was a motivation to write this poem. This poem has a very deep symbolic meaning for the identity of the author, for the source text author. It dwells upon the philosophy of of life, about mortality and immortality, the very poem about the body and soul, about life and death, and the central key notion there is the passage of time. Thus, literary critics talked about that the very structure of the poem is also very symbolic, because it has 24 stanzas, and each stanza has 60 syllables. So here we have this direct allusion to the time measurement, right? And according to the second criteria for the structure is that it has 4 dramatical acts. The first dramatical act comprises the first 4 stanzas, and the author enjoys the sea as tranquility. It is infinite, it's overwhelming, it's peace, and you feel the presence of God. The second dramatical act, he turns back, he sees the graveyard, and he starts to ponder upon his life. So this human consciousness comes into act, and he looks for truth. He tries to re-evaluate all the life problems that he is having. There's the third act, he meets the graves of the ancestors, and he's looking, and it's the biggest act actually, that his ancestors, his parents, didn't achieve anything during their life, but they were fighting so much. So the thing is that maybe we would not achieve this target that we have in life. But then in the last act, he still says that we have to fight, we have to move on, and we have to take risks. So these 4 acts, actually presuppose this internal dynamics of the poem. What is more, this poem has a very enigmatic nature and imagery, because you're not having any concrete words. You have only abstract words, and it is very typical of the symbolist poem when we have this general omission of the specifics. Thus, what is a translation of such a source text? It is a hermeneutic task for a translator, right? So he should go quite deep, quite insightful into the author's poetics. He tries, and what is more, every translator, every receiver will see something his or hers. He will extrapolate it into the vision of his own life. And what is more, underneath those really abstract categories, we have this tradition of français clair. It means that we do not have very sophisticated language. The language stays quite simple, but the very metaphors, the very images are so deep that you don't require any additional treating of the text. Thus, here I find this quotation as a keynote to this poem interpretation. I give my reader the mechanism of my voice. I tribute myself to such an amazing thing. I read, I live under the power of words. And according to the philosopher Fishman in 1971, he mentioned that language is not merely a carrier of content, rather latent or manifest. Language itself is a content. And the continuation of this idea was developed by the Spanish scholar Beatriz Penaz-Ibanez, and she talks about identitarian function of language, that identities are meanings conveyed through associations, and they are linked to the socio-symbolic nature of the language use. What is more, in the climate, I would even say, of this identitarian function of language, Beatriz Ibanez projects her ideas onto the translation ground. And she mentions, the scholar mentions, that the question of identity in translation involves doubling of the textual identity, of the authorial identity, of the vocal identity. Well, vocal means the identity of characters, right? The speech acts throughout the text. And also that is the socio-cultural identity of the actual and the implied readers. Thus, I want to talk about the very term strategy because I find it quite technical, but I would talk more about the philosophy of translating Paul Valéry's monumental piece. For myself, I found just 3 ways out. The first way out could be a literal translation. So you stay on the surface of language, and language is a content in itself, right? So this literal translation mechanism could empower the target reader to receive the original message. The other way out could be hermeneutic translation. Thus, you get this deep understanding of the authorial source authorial poetics, and you try to reproduce it by the linguistic accommodation for the target audience. And the last way out, it's reconcretization translation, or in Professor Coulommiers' terms, as for Locage, that is recreational translation, means that you try to reproduce it, satisfying the socio-cultural identity of the target receiver. Thus, here we are having the Ukrainian translators of this monumental poem, and they are so diverse from many standpoints, but they are united by one thing. All of these translators represent the second part of the 20th century, but they pertain to different philosophies of translation. And what is important for me here is that I'm not so much interested in the sociological aspect, in the sociological criteria, that they are practically more or less of the same age, but on the aesthetical, as I will say, aesthetically focused. I will try to penetrate onto the aesthetical ground of their interpretations. In this case, if we need to get the philosophy of the translators, we need to foreground, if, as Russian formalists put it, the context that determined the translator's vision. The first translation was that I want to analyze is the translation done in early 1990s, and actually it was published in a journal of Sesivit, that is a journal that totally dedicated to translated literature in Ukraine, and it was published in 1997. Professor Koptilov, actually he was a leading Ukrainian translation studies scholar, translation critic, and he was a professor of Taras Shevchenko Kyiv University. He presented the first doctoral thesis in translation studies in Ukraine in 1971, and what is more, his mapping of the discipline was done even before the James Holmes traditional map. Right, but somehow because of the we were living behind the Iron Curtain, the scheme was not relevant and was never lobbied, let's put it in such a way, in the West. And he advocated the idea that translation is a literary work in the target language that preserves an idea and imagery essence of the original and becomes a semantic stylistic parallel. And he has this ethical principle that the consciousness of the translator establishes a so-called intermediate instance, that is we take the inherent elements of the structure of the source text, and it's our main goal to reproduce them in the target language. And his translation of Le Cimetière Marin by Paul Valéry can be considered as a classical translation. The language continues the strand of Français clair. He stays in the limits of the normative literary Ukrainian language. He preserves those abstract images, but what is peculiar is that he has a lot of epithet additions, that additional characterization of different images. The other translation was done by Mykola Lukács. That is the recreational translation. During his life, it was not published because he was a prolific Ukrainian translator whose translation projects made blatant censorship in Soviet times, and due to which he was actually excommunicated from the literary process. So the commissioners didn't allow him actually to publish all the translations. Thus, his translation of Le Cimetière Marin was published by another translation critic, and they appeared in the periodical Poesie in 1987 and later republished in the anthology Тисячоліття, which gathered the most remarkable Ukrainian translations of the world poetry through its existence. To understand the fundamental focus of the translation projects of Mykola Lukács, we can dwell upon the quotation by Mikhailo Moskalenko that his fundamental idea was to recreate by means of literary artistic translation the Ukrainian culture in its true and full dimensions, since it couldn't realize its potential due to multiple apocalyptic catastrophes of Ukrainian history. In this case, he uses a lot of Ukrainian dialects, a lot of Ukrainian archaic words, and all these words, they were not listed in the dictionaries of Ukrainian language at that time, because at that time there was a tendency to adjust the Ukrainian language and the Ukrainian vocabulary to the Russian language. And actually it caused a lot of awkward and artificial word combinations. And he was against that tendency. And his translations actually brightly depicted this orientation. Thus, his Valéry translation makes a very bright example of language richness with the use of dialects and archaic words. The translation, the third translator, it's Oleg Zuyevsky. We will call this translation an experimental one. He called himself translation exercise. He used even the French word for it. It was first published in Suchasnits, that is Ukrainian journal published outside the Soviet bloc until the 1990s, and later it was republished in the anthology of his works. And here we can talk about the so-called elective affinity in the translation choices. His own preface mentioned that I would rather consider my poetical compositions a certain type of exercise done in order to analyze my own stream of consciousness, to master my forms of expression. And what is very important here, that he left Ukraine in the dramatic times of the Second World War. He went through all the deportation camps, and he appeared in Canada. He was the professor at the University of Alberta, and he actually favored this modernistic stream, Thomas Eliot, Ezra Pound style, and he saw that the Ukrainian literary policy system actually lacks this style, this tendency. Thus, he translated French symbolist poetry that was in tune with actually his original writings. So here we have this very experimental tendency of translation that actually the Ukrainian translators that were staying in the limits of Ukraine lacked. And the other point is Mikhailo Moskalenko. We can call this translation as a hermeneutic one. It was published already in the epoch of independent Ukraine. And what is very important, that he made a so-called compromise between a Lukács practice, this recreational domestication practice, and Viktor Kuptilov's one. That is very normative, literary, elitist translation. So he has this kind of a double vision. And what is more, he, in my opinion, I may suppose that he moves the Ukrainian translation culture with the introduction of these archaic words, dialects, from the marginal to the canonical. So right now in the Ukrainian translations, we may say that we may use sometimes, if it's suitable to the style of the original, the archaic words, the dialects, the colloquial speech, and all the rest. And what is more, actually, Mikhailo Moskalenko stood as an initiator of publishing the translations by Lukács. He was a Kiev-based translation erudite, actually with education in biological sciences, and compiler of many volumes of translated literature, where he revisited and pictured the true Ukrainian translation tradition. Thus, if we need the illustration, because of course I'm talking about the poem and I have not provided any kind of example, you have the two French extracts, Amongst the Lons, the Devise d'un l'homme, and in the Ukrainian part of Viktor Kuptilov you have this very abstract image, Otysha u mені, and it has a very deep illocutionary force if we will put it in the framework of the speech act theory. While Lukács and Zuyevs and Moskalenko, they provide this direct translation. Моє мовчання, моє мовчання. Oleg Zuyevsky, all the time, he was very modernist, very experimental. We have this мені цей спокій звів душі будову. We have this fluctuationism strategy, as Yuri Shevlyov called it, that you make this awkward, indirect, inversive syntactic structures, not atypical sometimes for the Ukrainian poetry, to emphasize certain elocutionary force. And also Oleg Zuyevsky, the third one in the table, has this золотоцяний череп'яний дах. Again, this very vivid, realistic image. And the last point, Brisé mon corps, cette forme pensive. Розбий мислительні всі формі неживі. Right? Розбий мислительні. We have this very philosophical idea. Lukács, скинь тіло пута, Хдумну цю химеру. Puta in the Ukrainian language has a very deep image, a very deep symbolic meaning, and he introduces that actually into the target text. Zuyevsky, відкиньмо форму дум у їх печалі. A very easy, not that sophisticated image. And Mikhailo Moskalenko, так розбивай же тіло форму власну. Again, it's like a combination, a very gold, I would call it a gold standard of all the translations. Thus, thank you for attention. Дякую за увагу. I just tried to stay concise in the limit, the time limit. Thank you.